the metric that should be used instead of using GDP per capita to really make a determination whether the country can graduate. We should use HDI, Human Development Index. The doer of the action is not responsible for the outcome of those actions. Moral hazard.
The floods in 97-98, they cost Kenya, I think, around 70 billion shillings. And the subsequent drought that came with it until the year 2000, I think they put the cost at around 220 billion.
10, 15 years later, 20 years later, these same African countries that were debt forgiven, they have found themselves in the same position.
If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. But once you stop digging, you're still in a hole.
From an economic perspective, is easy come, easy go.
They always say it's a catchphrase, give us the loans and leave us alone.
I feel Kibaki being an economist, what he was doing is first laying the foundation. And laying the foundation, he needed first of all to reach out to the low-hanging fruits.
Marshall Plan recipients, they received a debt jubilee of, I think, about 10 years.
Fools and fanatics are usually very confident, but wise people are usually full of doubts. So the wise people never go for political positions.
Yeah, some of these loans, they go back to colonialism.
What happened is that banks also became very selfish.
It appears that graduation from an LDC to an LMIC is almost becoming something like a punishment.
When someone demonizes the IMF, and I ask, it is us who go to IMF. You need to move from Muthaiga and you go to Kangemi or somewhere in Juja. And then you say, I'm giving you conditions.
There are people who are arguing in a much conspiratorial fashion that this is another trap laid for developing countries.
Do they also hire people who are not qualified in their own businesses?
What is always referred to as capital flight from frontier markets like Kenya and even from emerging markets. The money is going back to a safe haven, and the safe haven is
US
treasury bills and bonds.
There are people who are given a loan facility by the HELB. So if you continue to pay 3,000, you are not even paying the interest in full, leave alone to start paying the principal amount.
You have more LDCs in Africa, more than, let's say, you had in 1971 for the entire globe.
If we are borrowing at a higher rate, then the economy is growing, and then the way we are repaying, it is a hole that we are continuing to dig.
If debt were to be forgiven, or even suspended for, let's say, 5 years, it might lead to the crash of the entire global financial system. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for tuning in to the Nubianometry podcast, episode 002. Today we have a very interesting guest. He's an academic and he's also an economics and geopolitics commentator in Kenya. His name is Dr. Alex Kamau, and I think he also runs a firm, a company called Kamau and Associates. And today we'll be touching on a huge range of topics. So we'll be looking at issues in and around geoeconomics on the African continent, but also in Kenya. We'll try and cover a few topics regarding the volatility of African currencies, debt distress, and graduation from LDCs to LMICs. We'll also look at the issue of debt forgiveness, which has been championed by a lot of African leaders over the past couple of years, especially after COVID hit, and many other topics. So if you want to catch the entire conversation, stay on until the end. So Dr. Alex Kamau.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for honoring my request.
And thank you very much for having me.
And being our guest 002. Maybe just to kick us off, would you want to also introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And here I'm guest number 2. So it's a pleasure to be part of this great journey that has just started.
Yeah.
I know a great journey starts with one step, a journey of 1,000 miles.
Journey of 1,000 miles.
Probably this is the second step. So my name is Dr. Alex Kamau. As you have put it very clearly, I am an academician. I am a lecturer. I lecture currently at Riara University and Cooperative University. And when I'm not lecturing, I'm an entrepreneur. I run a company called Kamau and Associates, which is basically a business consulting firm where we help clients to put in order their tax issues, financing, investment, and as well as bookkeeping. So generally, it is a one-stop solution for business problems. So we offer solutions to all business problems.
Okay.
Yes.
And it also goes without saying that you are a well-known, I'd rather say, commentator
yes.
on a lot of issues affecting not only Kenya but also the continent of Africa.
That's true.
And that's why I was like, this will be a very interesting guest for the Nubianometry podcast, because my focus is to do geopolitics, geoeconomics, and also development issues affecting the African continent.
Wonderful.
So maybe to kick us off, Dr. Kamau.
Yes.
A very huge issue that has been affecting not only Kenya, but also the East African region, the floods.
Yes.
It was definitely not one of the things we're going to talk about, but of course, it's a very pertinent contemporary issue at the moment.
That's for sure.
What's your take about the amount of, let's say, the economic cost it will have on the Kenyan economy?
It's quite huge. Actually, the natural calamities, they do affect the developing economies in a bigger way than it does the developed economies. And it is so unfortunate that these calamities are largely being caused or triggered by the developed economies. And the people who are on the receiving end is the developing economies. Remember, it comes about the issue about climate change because of pollution of air and the general ecosystem. So that's why we are seeing floods happening at a higher rate. The issue of fire, the issue of, actually they are called the 3 Fs, floods, fire, and famine. So at the end of the day, the people who are causing these calamities to happen, they don't get... they don't suffer. They are not the ones who are suffering the most. But as Kenyans, Africa at large, we are on the receiving end. Like recently, I had the president of Kenya saying that before floods started, the number of kids who were on the feeding program were about 1.5 million. But now after the flood started, now they are planning to increase the number of children who will be in that program to about 3 million. So he's saying that he will have to cut money and funds or resources that would have gone to development agenda to now feeding those children.
They will have to be reallocated.
Which is quite unfortunate.
I was reading I think it's a report by the World Bank. I think about 10 years ago something. So they were looking at the floods in 97, 98. I mean, I was a kid back then, I think 8 years old. I think you are, hopefully you are much more older.
A bit older.
Yes. Do you remember that floods, and if you compare it with what we've been having over the past month? Because a couple of colleagues of mine, they were much older than me. We were talking with them about it earlier this week. And one of them was telling me that he remembers it, but it was much more slow. It was not as intense. But then I think it started in November of 97 until March of 98. So it was like 4 months. While with this one, I think it's mostly been during April.
Do
you have any recollections of the floods? How big it was?
Yes, I do remember. Of course, I was younger. I remember very well. I think I'm very good with the dates because I was actually in class 7. In the village. So I remember...
In which county?
In Murang'a County. In Murang'a County. So, of course, the damage, the effect, and the impact of those prolonged rains were not as much as we have experienced today. But mainly because I would think even the intensity that we have experienced this time around is higher than it was experienced about maybe 15 years ago. In terms of maybe even encroaching on riparian reserve, people building around the waterways. That time it was not much
of an issue.
Much of an issue. But currently with the issue of urbanization, people moving from rural to urban areas. Now
the urban density that comes with it.
Yes.
And then you block all the waterways.
Yes.
And then it just goes downhill from that.
Actually, it is unfortunate that the current governor of Nairobi, Sakaja, is not very keen to first expand the infrastructure before actually recommending that we cannot start doing buildings up to the 25th story. Yes. So it's I think that amounts to putting the cart before the horse or before the donkey. We should start with the infrastructure
first.
And once we are good to go, now we can now start developing vertically.
And actually, if you look at, let's say, Tatu City,
yes,
or also Konza Technopolis,
yes,
they are all going with that particular idea. You first start with laying the infrastructure and everything.
Yes.
You build it up, and then people will come.
That's for sure.
But you don't go the other way around.
You don't go the other way around. And it's a big question about how is public participation supposed to happen? Because most Nairobians are saying we don't want that. We have already started seeing the disadvantages of having many buildings coming up without being supported by proper infrastructure. But now the executive of the county of Nairobi, they are saying we have no choice. Whether you like it or you don't like
we
it.
Have to build up.
In Kiswahili, the way they say upende usipende, we have to go up.
Yeah. The report I looked at,
yes,
I think they quoted something like the floods in 97-98, they cost Kenya, I think, around 70 billion shillings, and the subsequent drought that came with it until the year 2000, because of course, unfortunately, when the floods come like the way they did, and in the planting season, then unfortunately we know drought is around the corner.
Yes.
And the subsequent drought over 98, 99 until 2000, I think they put the cost at around 220 billion. So that the combined economic cost was around 290 billion, which at the time, I think corresponded to about 14% of Kenya's GDP. And of course, like I looked up the figure of Kenya's GDP, I think from a World Bank report in 97, 98, they had it at about 14 billion US dollars. And IMF had it somewhere around 18. But still, like if you combine the two phenomena, El Nino, La Nina, 300 billion shillings roughly to the GDP at the time. It's not a direct line that you can draw from then to now. But do you think like it will be somewhere in that region, like the economic cost to Kenya, for instance?
Yeah, I feel it will be quite high. It will be quite high. And now that you have mentioned in 1998, maybe it did, the government of Kenya spent about 70 billion. I'm quite surprised because
that was the cost.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I think they received funding, emergency funding, especially from the World Bank.
Yes.
To reconstruct the roads because a lot of roads were destroyed.
Bridges.
And I already think this time round, roads have been destroyed across the country. Bridges, classrooms, so that even in schools, money that maybe could have gone to, let's say, you had mentioned the feeding program.
The feeding program.
Or buying books. It will have to be maybe reallocated and repurposed. To build classrooms.
Actually, I wanted to say that I remember by the time Moi was leaving office, the last budget he read was for 250 billion. That was in 2002.
Okay.
So when we talk 70 billion in 1998, so I would think if budget for Kenya in 2002 was about 250 billion, it must have been maybe 200 billion in 1998.
Yeah.
So almost 30% of
almost 30%.
Yes, of the country's GDP was
of the country's budget.
Budget exactly, not GDP of the country's budget was utilized in fighting those calamities. So even today, maybe it would not, of course, get to 30%, but it would be a significant figure.
Yeah.
And largely, sometimes we tend to only quantify the financial cost, the economic cost, but economical cost. But when it comes to maybe the issue of death, even something like now, the schools have to be the opening of the schools have to be postponed by 2 weeks.
Yeah.
There are so many unsaid losses that people have suffered.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, it is not only the financial cost, but even social cost and other costs that come with that kind of a calamity.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, just the mental cost that comes with it.
Yes.
And my mom comes from Kano Plains, which unfortunately always always suffers a lot of flooding. And she was just telling me today a few of my nephews were with my mom back in Moroni, in Koru. So they're going back because of the schools opening. But I was asking, like, we had seen videos of the schools completely flooded, water like almost halfway through the buildings. And she was like, from what she's heard, they are going to be collected 3 schools into 1 school.
Wow.
So I was like, inasomeka kweli? That's what she even asked
me.
And I was like, isomeki.
So that some schools can continue being used as a rehabilitation center. So what do you call it?
But in that case, I think not necessarily. Because the other schools are just still flooded.
They're still flooded.
They're still flooded. They're much closer to Lake Victoria, and so nobody can go back to school there.
Yes. Wow. Is it an issue of maybe the way we would say even public institutions encroaching the riparian area?
I think
too close to the...
That's a little bit complicated because they've always been living, like, if you go almost close to the Lake Victoria, all along you can take whichever direction from Bondo, Uyoma, come to Kisumu, come to Kano Plains, go down all the way to Kindu Bay, Homa Bay, Mbita. I think people have generally, they just build closer to they'll just tell you this is our land, has always been our land. And I don't know if where you come from in Muranga it's also a similar case. Even where I come from in Moroni, even along the sides of the river, all the rivers that are flowing there, people own land. There's no idea, there's no, maybe it's there, but it's not cast in stone that hey, this is riparian land. You should not build next to a river.
A certain distance from the river, and they actually, I don't know whether they gave those people notices, but maybe they had been given prior. So this time around, to avoid crisis or actually plunging into further crisis, the government has taken that initiative to actually demolish. So there is that law that protects the riparian land.
Riparian land. But is it a law that applies mostly to urban areas? Because in rural areas, I honestly, I don't know, because Moroni, for instance, I heard, I think a year or 2 ago, the county government wanted to bring in planning. And so it means everybody gets a title deed for the land they have, but you have to build permanent structures, etc. So I don't know that. I think maybe in urban areas, of course, it already makes sense.
For sure.
But I think in rural areas, maybe the planning is coming.
I think in the rural areas, the developments are not very controlled because actually, even in terms of space, they are not very squeezed. And I don't see why someone would really want to build a house just next to the river in the rural areas, because there they own chunks, maybe acres of land, 2, 5, and all. But here in Nairobi, in urban areas, getting a quota, you are considered a dynasty.
A 50 by 50.
A 50 by 50.
So tying the floods that is happening currently in Africa. Economically, they're always called the global shocks. I mean, we had COVID-19. We had the supply chain disruptions that followed. And right now, slightly, those 2 global shocks, they also brought in an aspect that mainly affects developing countries, the issue of debt distress. And I think on the African continent, it has been much more pronounced than in any other region across the world.
That's true.
Do you think this issue of debt distress and global climate change shocks, like, is there a way that African countries can maybe make their voice much more stronger in the international system? Last year, there was a figure by the World Bank or the IMF that I think 22 of
African countries,
of all 54 African countries are under debt distress. Some are much more severe, but some it's much more manageable. But when it's manageable, they are facing liquidity challenges. So do you think, like, all these factors brought together, like, how can African countries actually chart a way out?
A very good question. And also I had our President Ruto is very passionate about pushing for better terms when developing countries have been given loan facilities by Bretton Woods institutions. They are saying that they are always given at a higher rate compared to the developed countries. And he's saying he would want to have an even playing field where all the members of IMF and Bretton Woods institutions in general, they are given loans or funding at a similar rate. And I don't know. I don't I think our president is very genuine or honest, because like here in Kenya, we ascribe to risk-based lending. That if I go to the bank to acquire a loan facility and they think that I'm not very credit worthy, they will charge me. They will give me a loan facility at a rate of 22%. But when another corporate institution like Safaricom, which they are referred as a blue chip, is referred as a blue chip company, they will be given at a rate of about 16%. So there's that discrimination based on my risk profile. So the same thing around the year 2020. The lending in Kenya was there was interest rate capping, that the banks should not loan any Kenyan at a rate more than 4% above the CBR, central bank rate. And so if the CBR currently, like now, CBR is at 13%. Yes, 13%. So the law was that no bank should lend anyone at a rate more than 17%, 13 plus 4. But what happened is that banks also became very selfish, that they decided they were discriminating the SMEs, small medium enterprises, from accessing the funding, and therefore that law was actually was revoked or was discontinued, and it was decided that we adopt a risk-based lending. Risk-based lending, that the financial institution will have the latitude either to loan you or not to loan you if they feel that you are a high-risk borrower. You are a high-risk borrower. And I think it does make sense. It is those are the basics of economics, that if you are an investor, you would want to invest in low risk enterprises or projects with high returns. So basically, if you have like 5 projects and all these projects have the same risk, you would now choose the project that has the highest return because they have the same risk. If they have the same return, these 5 projects, you would now choose. They have the same return. You would not choose the project with the lowest risk. It's called the modern portfolio theory. It was invented by Harry Markowitz. That you choose. So the same thing. That time, because the financial institutions in Kenya, they didn't have much money. The liquidity was also a problem. So whenever they are told that you need to lend the money to businesses, to households, to government, and you are told that same rate of return, you will charge them same rate of return. So they could only give loans to the institutions or individuals that had lower rate of risk because the return is same, 17% for all of us. Then they don't want to work with the individuals or the households or the small medium enterprises. They only go for blue chip companies or the government. So in the same context, when it comes to international lending, there is no way, or doesn't make economic sense or financial sense for the president to push that the developing countries that are not they are not developed and who don't have a history of investing properly the money that they are given to be given money or to be offered more lending or funding at the same rate with the developed countries like US, like the industrialized countries. Because even, it is, I think I find it been very ridiculous. Because our treasury bonds right now, we are issuing or we are selling, because now it is selling, the government selling, and if you want to invest with treasury bonds, you are actually buying. So the government is selling treasury bonds at a rate of 18% per annum. But you will see US, they are selling their treasury bonds at a rate of about maybe 7%, because right now their CBR, their Fed rate is about 5.5%. So you would imagine that their treasury bond would be slightly higher than the CBR. So let's call it 8%. So if locally you are selling at 18%, why do you want another institution to sell it to you at a lower rate when you are not doing it yourself. So if we want to access funding at the same rate with developed countries, then can we also ensure that we sell our treasury bonds at the same rate that they are selling? Because the US, they are selling at, let's call it 8%, as we are at 18%.
But don't you think in Kenya at the moment,
yes,
the interest rate,
yes,
it's also a function of, and I think it's going to tie nicely with one of the themes we're going to talk about,
the
volatility of the Kenyan shilling, and the Fed rate hikes that have been happening, I think, since for the last 2 years or so.
That's true.
And the fact that anytime the Fed increases the rates, like it has been doing aggressively, quantitative tightening over the past 2 years, there's a lot of what is always referred to as capital flight from frontier markets like Kenya and even from emerging markets. The money is going back to a safe haven, and the safe haven is US treasury bills and bonds. And so anytime we have the CBK, African central banks, they also raise their rates to fight inflation. But part of it is also a function of, let's say, the Fed rate hikes. Don't you think that also ties in so that you cannot really say that Kenya should not complain when industrial countries are getting loans at a much lower rate, financing, while for us as developing countries, we are given extremely way high rates?
It does make sense. And I support I concur with what you have said. And because actually we are just saying that we are not in the same league or the same risk profile with those developed countries. I don't know, it comes back to an individual person. I'm asking you have these 5 projects, probably maybe let me just say 5 projects for the sake of just making it very simple. And you have 100,000 to lend to, or to invest rather. Would you rather invest in a project that is giving you a 20% rate of return, or the one that is giving you at a rate of actually not in terms of risk return, but in terms of risk.
In terms of risk.
How
risky?
Yeah. If this 100,000, would you lend it to a firm that is 20% risky, or the one that is 10% risky?
The one that is 10% risky.
Yeah, the one that is 10% risky.
You go with the risk.
We go with the risk. And if this other person whose risk profile or whose risk level is 20% really want money from you, then you would actually charge this person a high rate of return to compensate you for the risk. So you charge or you demand a return premium.
There is also the argument, a lot of leaders in the global south, they are saying, for instance, when it comes to the credit rating agencies, you have like the big 3. They are all based in the US. S&P, Fitch, and S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. Moody's. Yeah, exactly, the 3. So they're all based in the US. And there's even a time, I think, earlier in the year, when somebody asked, I think it's the US Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, about it. And I think it was even the president of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon. It was a question along the lines of, the credit rate, is there something that can be done about the credit rating agencies?
I would point out to the rating agency, that there are a bunch of countries rated higher than us, like AAA, but they live under the American enterprise military system. To have them be AAA and not America is kind of ridiculous.
Because even I think Janet Yellen, the statement she said was that it's sometimes unfair. Because I think that also degraded the US risk portfolio or something of the sort.
Fitch's decision is puzzling in light of the economic strength we see in the United States. I strongly disagree with Fitch's decision, and I believe it is entirely unwarranted.
So anyway, many African leaders, and once again, I think it ties nicely to one of the other themes we are going to look at, the Bridgetown Initiative, which is being led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Motley. This notion that there is so much disadvantage when the credit rating agencies somewhere in the US, they decide for the entire globe. And then it makes African countries, it makes countries in the Caribbean, even in Asia and Latin America, their risk is somehow viewed as very high, whether that's true or not, and it negatively impacts even the investment flows into developing countries.
That's true. There's that there is that concern that the credit ratings, they are not, so to say, very professional, that they are biased, that they...
Or maybe they just have a very narrow view.
Yes.
They are looking at things from, let's say, the US perspective only.
From the US
Exactly.
perspective.
And if you are not maybe part of the collective West,
Yes.
you are in the global South, then they are looking at you through only one lens.
That is an issue. It's a controversial issue, but all I understand is that there are measures that they use, and they are quite they are in the public domain about maybe the GDP growth, the GDP per capita, the inflation, the strength of your currency, the exports that you are making, all those.
Yes, there's a range of indicators.
There are
use,
yes, there are a range of
it's
indicators.
It's as scientific as it can get.
Yes, though there's that concern that out of the about 8 indicators that they use, only about 3 of them are quantitative in nature. The other about 5, they are qualitative in nature. The qualitative meaning they are somehow subjective. They are not very objective, because the way you would ask, what do you think about the Kenyan economy? A question like that one, or a metric like that one. So there's that concern, yes. But I think I would rather we move away from that kind of a narrative. You hear, even here in the Kenyan context, we hear a politician, when he wins, then he praises the IEBC.
That's the Electoral Commission
in
Kenya.
Yes, Electoral Commission of Kenya. But when the same individual loses, now he demonizes.
It's the devil.
Yes.
And sometimes it also goes on the level of the election. Like if in the county, the governors, the MPs, all your results you all won, it's okay, but when it comes to the presidential level,
you didn't win. Now
you attack the same organization that validated your win in a much lower level election.
Yes. I think it is becoming an African issue now that we are starting to also attack the credit rating agencies. But I think what we need to do is also to ensure what value are we coming with at the negotiating table.
There's another point. I think last year you had this huge new financing pact, financial architecture, that was organized by the French President Macron in Paris. I think it was in June last year. I remember, if I'm not wrong, either it was the Mia Motley, the Barbados Prime Minister, or I think it was one of the African leaders. It would have been even President Ruto. They mentioned something about the Marshall Plan in post-war Europe, and the fact that Marshall Plan recipients, they received a debt jubilee of, I think, about 10 years. And I think the argument that was made at the summit was also like, because of the climate shocks, and this is something that, of course, you mentioned rightly at the beginning, countries in the global south are suffering much more. Exactly. And they're suffering for something they played a very little role in causing. And so the argument was, because of the climate emergency at the moment, maybe let's give the global south countries also a debt jubilee of 10 years. The same way Western Europe countries that were devastated by World War II were also given a little bit of a leeway, even in the Marshall Plan, so that they had 10 years to organize themselves. And after that 10-year period, essentially what you had were economic miracles. Economic miracle in Germany, 1954 onwards, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in many other Western Europe countries. Going with the idea of the debt jubilee, do you think it's something that is a good thing when leaders in the global south are arguing for it? Or do you think it's also something that is not genuine?
Yes, I remember actually President Ruto was the one who was on the forefront, and he has been doing very well in terms of carrying the whole Africa by his shoulders. Yes, he was saying that, like in the Kenya, he would say we are not asking you to forgive our debt. All we are asking is that currently in Kenya, he would say, if I quote him, he would say currently in Kenya, I'm paying 1.2 trillion to in terms of debt repayment, debt service. So if the payment can be suspended for 5 years, so that this 1.2 trillion, I can channel it to development activities in Kenya. do infrastructure, build bridges, ports, and all that, including dams, then in the next 5 years, I will have more paying power, and I will be able to start paying what I had not paid for the last 5 years during this some sort of a moratorium. Whether it's a good thing or not, I would say...
Well, maybe not good thing,
yes,
but is it feasible? Maybe that might be a much better term.
I would say it is feasible. It is feasible. It is possible. But the question is, would it work?
Will it work?
Would it work? I don't think so. I don't think so.
And will there also be like the political will, let's say, from the West, for instance, to say, okay, let's do that? Because the reason I'm saying that, once again, I read a blog article on the website of the IMF. I think it was from, 2001 or 2002. And they were looking at the issue of the debt jubilee. Because apparently, I think it was also a very huge issue in the 90s.
Yes.
And that's what led to the HIPC?
The highly indebted poor countries.
Poor countries. And then much later, I think with COVID, we had the DSSI.
Yes.
So... at the time in the 90s, there was a very huge push for a debt jubilee to developing countries.
Yes.
And I think the article is from 2001 or 2002.
And it did happen.
And he made an argument that if debt were to be forgiven, or even suspended for, let's say, 5 years, it might lead to the crash of the entire global financial system. And another argument he also made is part of the repayments that are made is what allows, let's say, the international financial institutions to continue giving out loans. So that even, for instance, for the IMF, it's a lender of last resort. And the reason why IMF will come to a country when they're in dire straits is because it has financing from other people. And other people who have previous loans are actually servicing the loans so that there is that pool of money maintained. But the moment you suspend it, you give a debt jubilee for 5 years, then it means no more money is being is coming into the common pool. And let's say stronger economies in the global north mostly, they will have to put extra funds to maintain the pool. And if they say, no, we find that is a risky thing, we are not going to do it, then if it is suspended for 5 years, it could essentially lead to Western countries saying we are not giving any more loans. And then a country that now gets caught in dire straits, they'll be on their own. So that was one of the arguments he was making against the issue of the debt jubilee, a longer period of debt suspension. But of course, people on the debt jubilee side, they're like, some of these loans, they go back to colonialism, and even much deeper. And the leaders who are receiving them, of course, a lot of them were lost in corruption and embezzlement, let's say in the 70s, in the 80s and 90s. And they're like, why should Kenyans, why should Africans, why should Caribbeans pay for the mistakes, the normal citizens, pay for the mistakes of leaders who did things, let's say in the 70s and 80s, where there was a Cold War, and some of those leaders were actually encouraged by the same Western governments. That kind of narrative or reasoning.
It does make sense. Though from where I stand,
from an economic perspective,
from an economic perspective, is easy come, easy go. And I strongly understand the debt relief were actually implemented in 1990s to quite a good number of African countries. And 10, 15 years later, 20 years later, these same African countries that were debt forgiven, they have found themselves in the same position. In the same trap. In the same hole. Yes, they never learned the lesson. There's
this interesting quote. It's even been made like a law, an urban legend, internet law. Like the law of holes. Probably you've heard of it. Like it's always used a lot when it comes to the issue of debt. If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. But once you stop digging, you're still in a hole.
You're still in a hole.
So you have to get yourself out. Yes. So I always find it like, of course, easy come, easy goes, as he says. And another criticism, of course, the bad governance in many African countries.
For sure.
The global south. And there's this also another quote about African leaders. It's sometimes said, they always say it's a catchphrase, give us the loans and leave us alone. Like, don't give us conditions about this and this, improve governance here, consolidate. loss-making parastatals so
Yes,
that you
yes.
have an
And
organization that is
privatize.
more and privatized,
Yes,
that is
yes.
much more efficient.
Yes, yes.
Just say, no, give us the loans
Yes,
and leave us alone.
And actually, they are usually left alone. Like we were left alone from 2014 to 2024 during our maiden Eurobond. We were left alone. Only 10 years later, we all of a sudden it comes to a realization that we need to pay a debt that we had borrowed in 2014. It's like it was a surprise to us. And all along we knew the contract said that within 10 years we need to repay. So yes, when we are left alone, then we really somehow like bury our head in the sand like the proverbial ostrich. Which should not be the case. Which should not be the case. In terms of the African leadership, I see that the unfortunate bit is that in Africa, you find that, I would say as it is, that fools and fanatics are usually very confident, but wise people are usually full of doubts. So the wise people never go for political positions. But the people who are very confident and they assume they are oozing knowledge and they know how to fix it, they are the people who actually should not be doing that. So at the end of the day, we become like the issue of a person. It's Alexander the Great who said that I would rather fear a flock of lions or a sheep, a flock of sheep led by a lion than the other way around. So unfortunately in Africa, we usually have a way of just voting, or the people who offer themselves for those political positions are not the best of they're not the best of the best. And when we engage them, they are easily compromised by the West. Their interests are taken care of. And we hear our African presidents, usually they are summoned at Beijing. They are summoned, they are not invited. Sometimes they are summoned in London, to London,
Washington, D.C.
Yes, and when they go there, it is very unfortunate that I was talking to another Kenyan who is staying in Germany. And she was telling me that there was a discussion that the Kenyan government was doing with the German government, and the Kenyans living in Germany, they felt they should have been involved because they know they have a lot to offer in terms of value when it comes to that kind of a discussion. But it was very unfortunate that the Kenyan delegation that went there, they did not incorporate the Kenyan
views of the Kenyan
yes. So they felt
marginalized in
marginalized,
a way, even
and
though they have a lot of experience
and value
knowledge,
value that they can give. So that's where I feel we usually go wrong.
There's an article, I think it was one of the leaders of I think it's UNCTAD, I'm not sure, but she made allusions to the fact that it appears that graduation from an LDC to an LMIC is almost becoming something like a punishment to developing countries. So that the moment you graduate, you are told now the amount of concessional funding you can receive is way reduced, and you only have two options. You either raise the revenues locally, you go for syndicated loans, or you go for Eurobonds. And do you think when you look at, what you had said earlier, that African countries or countries in the developing world, it appears that even with the problem with the Eurobond in Kenya, it appears that almost 10 years after graduating from an LDC to an LMIC, there are people who are arguing in a much conspiratorial fashion that this is another trap laid for developing countries. Do you think it's a trap?
I really don't think it is a trap, because for you it's like when you are growing from being a baby to adolescence to now a mature person, and now you say adolescence is quite troublesome, and you don't want to go through that stage. You know what happened, and using the same approach or analogy about a human being, we when we are born, we are very dependent. Then at some point during adolescence, we become independent. We started being dependent, then independent. Then when you become mature, you become interdependent. That you also given value. So when we were classified as developing countries, now there we were fully dependent. We were fully dependent on grants, on concessionary loans, and
You mean when we were classified as LDCs?
LDCs.
The lowest rung of development. So to say.
Development, yes. So we are like in this journey of development, we are at the baby stage, which is we are now when you are a baby, you are very dependent. You are dependent on your parents for upkeep, for food, clothing, everything. You are not able to sustain yourself. That's how the developing countries have been for the longest, or as long as you are a developing country, you are a baby. And who would want to remain being a baby for the rest of his life?
No one.
At some point, you must graduate to becoming now independent. And being independent is that you feel, and that's what some countries in Africa actually had started being, that we say now we are now independent, and we want now to practice what is called protectionism policy. Protectionism policy is when you lock your borders, you say you are going to avoid the imports coming to your country, so that you can be able to jumpstart the local industry. Like in Kenya, we keep saying that we need to jumpstart the textile industry. We need to jumpstart Sony Sugar, the sugar industry, and all that. Even the manufacturing industry,
as well as protecting the infant industries. Also.
The infant upcoming industries. That's when you are independent. You feel just like an adolescent person. They don't want to listen to their parents. They want to go out and not to be questioned. So it is now that stage of a country when you feel you are independent and you can live by yourself. Until now, those other developed countries, they retaliate. They say you are practicing a protectionism policy, that you don't want our goods and services to come to your country. Then, okay, even us, we will not also allow you, just in case you happen to start exporting, we will not allow your goods to also come to our country. And of course, they are the big boys. They whenever they flex their muscle, as it is normally said, whenever US sneezes, the rest of us
the world catches a cold.
Catches a cold. So that part of being independent. But now when you develop and you graduate to interdependent, is when you realize that no country is an island, that we need each other. We now do economy liberalization. We open the borders, and we ensure that we are able to allow goods to come in and to come out. And by that can only happen if we allow something what is called the comparative advantage, that we only do what we are good at. Something that we are not good at, we leave it to countries which are good at, so that we can focus on our area of expertise. And our area of expertise at the moment, I would say, it is agricultural production, because the Kenyan economy is highly agrarian one. So when I see us saying that we really need to start doing the housing project, whenever the agriculture sector is not fully funded, you would be very surprised that in the Kenyan context, like last year we read a budget of 3.6 trillion. Maybe you can give a guess how much was allocated to the agriculture sector. It was 80 billion. 80 billion only. And
to a sector that contributes about 22% of the GDP.
Yes, exactly.
There's a huge mismatch between the two.
Yes, and more so, maybe 20% of the GDP, but how many Kenyans are employed directly or indirectly by the agriculture sector? More than 80%. And you give them about 80 to 90 billion. That I think it's a misplaced priority. So the issue of that that it is a trap as moving from LDC to a middle income country. I don't feel so. It's again the same narrative that I was talking about. Africans, when you are winning, you say the examiners they are okay. When you are losing, they are not fair.
And anyway, because also the moment of graduation, you already know, like, once you become an LMIC, these are the rules of the game.
These are the rules
like
of the
you
game.
won't receive concessional funding in the same breath you used to receive earlier. The options will be you raise finances, you tackle corruption and wastage, or you go for the syndicated loans and the Eurobonds. Anyway, at the start point of the graduation class, it's like somebody is giving you the power to read, and the entire thing is always said in graduation. So you already know, like 10 years from now, if I don't put my house in order, I'll probably end up in trouble. So I mean, you cannot claim in agency, or you cannot claim powerlessness, right?
That's for sure. That's for sure. And actually, also the metric that is used to really graduate a country from developing to a middle class country is about GDP per capita. They say it's GDP per capita. And you see, GDP per capita is not a very fair measure. Because we are just saying that the GDP for Kenya is 16 trillion and we are about 50 million, 54 million Kenyans. So once you divide there, you will find that per year, an average person is earning about $2,000. So on average, we are considered that every one of us is able to generate $2,000 in a year, because actually the threshold for you graduating is $1,000 USD per year. So as we are able to cross that around, as you said, around 2012, 2013, thereabout. But if you really go into the metrics that measures the human development, which is a human development index in Kenya, it is still very low. I think the metric that should be used, instead of using GDP per capita to really make a determination whether the country can graduate, we should use HDI, Human Development Index, because it could be a case, like the way we are saying, that our leaders, usually they are pocketed by the West. And so whenever the GDP is increasing, it is only increasing to a very small margin of the population. But the majority, they are still lavishing in abject poverty.
In abject poverty. There is this very interesting statistic still about the same issue about graduation from LDCs. That in Africa, I think in 1971, you only had 25 LDCs. No, that was in the entire world. 25 LDCs. In 2023, last year, there were 46. And of these 46, I think 35 or 36 are in Africa. So that you have more LDCs in Africa, more than, let's say, you had in 1971 for the entire globe. And I mean, you could say there are a few African countries that became independent. Let's say Namibia, you can talk about Eritrea, South Africa, Zimbabwe, also in 1980, and I think Angola. So it was post-1971. But it appears that actually you now have more LDCs than you had them in 1971. And the few countries that became independent later cannot completely account for that huge number. And maybe, I think you are probably conversant with Dambisa Moyo and the book she wrote, her magnus opus in 2009, Dead Aid. So for her, I think it was also along those lines that you have much more poverty, let's say, in Africa today than you had it in 1971. And of course, for her, she went with the narrative that it was development aid, foreign aid, that was actually causing this kind of stagnation, or it's not even stagnation, it's almost even like a step backwards. Because stagnation will be we stay with the 25 LDCs in the world. But we have 46 currently, and 36 of them are in Africa. So do you also think, like, to you, that also will be a case of we are blaming the examiner or the referee when we lose out?
I would say so. And it is Mahatma Gandhi that said we should be the change that we want.
We want to be.
So and unless we change, things will not change for us. And again, Albert Einstein is the one who said that madness is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. As long as we keep doing the same things in terms of even at this time and age, we are still exporting raw resources, raw materials, instead of doing value addition. And so as long as we will continue to do that, then we will not be able to really become self-sufficient, and we will continue to rely on foreign aid. And the issue of foreign aid, because there are some people who actually demonize the IMF and the World Bank, and they give us...
the IMF is always the perfect scapegoat. I was telling a colleague of mine
yes.
just the other week,
like
in many developing countries, anything goes wrong, put it on the IMF.
Put
a new tax is raised somewhere, of course. IMF is known for promoting fiscal consolidation. Any new tax being put somewhere, lay it at the feet of the IMF. Anyway, pick up your point.
For sure. And you know, the question I keep asking is these executives, the people who are leading this country, and even when they are doing appointments in parastatals, it is in the public domain that the people who are appointed in those positions of leadership, they have questionable credentials in terms of academics. So these same individuals, they run private businesses. They have manufacturing companies. They have well-to-do retail businesses. Do they also hire people who are not qualified in their own businesses? Of course they don't. Yeah. So there's this concept of moral hazard, whereby the doer of the action is not responsible for the outcome of those actions. The doer of the action is not responsible for the outcome of those actions. Moral hazard. You have a bus, or you have a matatu. You have employed a driver, and this driver will drive recklessly, including driving on pavement when trying to escape traffic or something. And by doing so, your car is damaged. But when it comes to paying for those repairs, he's not there. It is you. So he doesn't feel the pinch. So the same thing when it comes to the leadership of most African countries. Leaders, they behave in such a manner that they know, even if we don't hire the best of technocrats to run these ministries, to run these departments and agencies, and the company is not able to repay its debts, we will just go and raise another debt, another Eurobond, and we will not be personally responsible. And that's it. And that's why Maina it's called Jimmy Wanjigi has been pushing about odious debt. And it's more related to the issue of moral hazard. Because if you know that you will be personally held accountable, you would at least be able to behave better. But you borrow on behalf of and it is usually very painful for many Kenyans, because I normally see it's like someone going to borrow money using your parents' or your title deed. You know, like Kenya is a title deed, and all of us we are shareholders to this title deed. But very few people have the powers to go use this title deed to borrow money externally, and then they use money not necessarily for the right purposes. So we are likely to continue finding ourselves in this hole. And it's not even that we are not digging; we are actually digging it. You are actually digging it. You'll be very surprised, and I don't understand. I don't understand, because if the previous regime, for Uhuru Kenyatta left the country when it was indebted to a tune of 8.7 trillion, and right now we are talking we are indebted about 11 trillion. 10, 11, around 11 trillion. So it means we have moved from even, let's call it 9 to 11. Those are 3 trillions within 2 years. So per year we are borrowing about 1.5 trillion. And then the question is, if we are borrowing 1.5 trillion and our revenue collection is not growing at that rate, our revenue collection is not growing at that rate. So as much as every other time, like now I listened to the chairman of the Budget Appropriation Committee in Parliament, Didi Nyoro. He was saying that the coming year, they plan to borrow only 500 billion. And this year they had said they would borrow 700 billion.
Yeah.
So you would say if we have been borrowing 700 billion, assuming for those 2 years, it is coming to 1.4 trillion,
Yeah.
then why are we seeing the public debt moving from 8.7 to around 11 trillion? Yes.
Yeah.
So it is being said this in theory, but practically
Practical,
it's a different story.
On
It's
paper, it's one thing.
Yes.
But when you go on the ground,
It is a different thing.
you're borrowing an entirely different sum
Yes,
of money.
so we will. It's like, and I've seen people fall into that trap. There are people who are given a loan facility by the HELB. Maybe you are also a beneficiary. I was a beneficiary, and you see, someone was given maybe like 200,000, and 200,000 for the entire 4 years.
Period.
Yes, and what you are paying on a monthly basis is about 3,000.
Yeah.
And you are paying 3,000 on a monthly basis, but when you see the interest that this 200,000 is attracting on a monthly basis, it is about 5,000. So if you continue to pay 3,000, you are not even paying the interest in full, leave alone to start paying the principal amount. So you will be in that debt forever. So the same way, if we are borrowing at a higher rate than the economy is growing, and then the way we are repaying, it is a hole that we are continuing to dig. So, and at the end of the day, we will, again, when someone demonizes IMF, and I ask, it is us who go to IMF.
Borrowed the money.
And the way IMF, the way they react or the way they behave, you come, I've given you a loan of 100,000, and I know your income, let's say it's 200,000, and you still want to come for more money from me. Your income is 200,000. I've already given you 100,000. So I tell you, and I know your children go to the very expensive academies.
Yeah.
You live in Runda,
International schools.
You live in Runda or Muthaiga. And so I tell you, for me to give you more loans, you need to move from Runda and go to Buruburu.
Yeah.
You need to move from Muthaiga and you go to Kangemi or somewhere in Juja. And then you say, I'm giving you conditions. And you see, if you had not come for more funding, I would not have dictated your life.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I've heard people say a lot about Kenya's third president, Kibaki.
Yes.
And the idea that, of course, being an economist for the longest period of time, he had always avoided the IMF at all costs. And that if you look at the last program we had under the IMF, I think it was in the 90s, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
And only until recently in 2019, 2020 with COVID, and then the new IMF program, the current program that I think is going until 2025.
Yes.
So there is also the notion that if you know the IMF is a firefighter, then don't try as much as you can not to put your house on fire. Because once the firefighter comes, he'll tell you, you have to do this and that and that and that. And of course, he starts to put out the fire. But like he's going to definitely give you conditions. So the best way maybe to avoid those conditions is to simply not play the game.
I wouldn't really agree with that, Pius, because it's the game of finance is very simple. That if you are borrowing, if the cost of your funding, is maybe the cost is at 8%, then you need to invest in a project that is giving you a rate of return more than 8%. So if you just maintain those basics, there's nowhere you cannot borrow a loan, including IMF, including Eurobond. If Eurobond you have borrowed like the way we did the other day, we have borrowed at a cost of 10.85%. That is the interest rates that we'll be paying on that Eurobond. Ensure that you invest in a project that is giving you a better rate of return than that. But you see, we do it the other way around. I feel Kibaki, being an economist, what he was doing is first laying the foundation. And laying the foundation, he needed first of all to reach out to the low-hanging fruits, opening the economy, because that time is when he opened the economy. Mobile phones came to Kenya, motorbikes came to Kenya.
Zero rating,
yes. Many universities were opened. The media, even something like Royal Media came after Kibaki. So he opened the economy. So that was the first stage. The second second stage for Kibaki would have to fight corruption. Once he fights corruption, then now it would have been to go for those funding from IMF in a big way, and it would have been the right thing for him to do, as long as he was to ensure that the cost of loan or the cost of loan does not go beyond the return that we are getting after investing that money. So it doesn't matter whether it is IMF, whether it is any other source of concessional loan, funding, as long as you are investing in areas that are not generating a better rate of return more than the cost of loan, you will always find yourself in trouble. So it's about issue of governance.
It's about issue of governance.
Yes.